I want to be devil's advocate again. I've spent my whole career in technology. And at this point, I'm really having a lot of doubts. And as much as I believe in everything that Michael said, and I'm pushing for that, I worry about that. I mean, I've got a car I can't work on. I see that farmers are now are basically taking on Carrier, I think it is. Not Carrier, I'm thinking AEC. Who's the tractor company? John Deere, right, because they are signing end-user license agreements that they can't work on their own equipment, right? And there may be good reason for that. But boy, we can't even clean our buildings. And the notion that we're going to put sensors and actuators and we're going to write code systems and we're going to have operating systems in buildings, I'm not at all convinced that that's a viable direction. I see I've already got somebody fired up here. I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to let these guys take over. But it is a dialogue. So.
Okay, what comes up first?
Hi, Phil Christensen from Bentley Systems. I think it's a really good thing. And the reason it's a really good thing is that we're finally getting some modularization in there. And that you think of how many lines of code there are in your car, you really don't want to work on those lines of code, right? That's a really good thing. So, and the same is going to happen with buildings, with all infrastructure, actually componentizing it, including software componentization. Very positive.
Thank you for slapping me back into reality.
Jack, this first one's yours.
Oh, already?
You can do it from there.
Just a quick one. I have no financial interest in this operation. I'm simply here as a reporter to make you aware that people now have figured out how to take basalt. There's about 100,000 tons of basalt in southern Oregon, and with the right kind of glue around it, we can make all sorts of things. Here's one example. You can make rebar. 4 times the tensile strength of steel, won't rust or corrode, easier to cut, shape, etc., 75% lighter, etc. And by the way, we can use it on the planet Mars habitat because most of the surface of Mars is basalt. Another interesting application of it, it has a 99% resistance to electromagnetic waves. So a quarter-inch thick shield around anything will protect it from electromagnetic pulses, even nuclear pulses. So I simply want to make you aware of it. If you want to know anything more, you can bother Mike Owen over there. I've told you everything I know. Right? Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Howard Odom, who is a great systems thinker, teacher. These are his drawings. He has this notion of transformity and the notion that underneath all of it is ultimately energy. And if you look at this system, which maybe takes solar energy from the environment, and at each change in tropic level, we're using that energy, we're suffering from the second law of thermodynamics, and yet we're building something which is more significant, which is a measure of transformity. Our cities perhaps should be measured on the basis of their transformity. What are they accomplishing for human civilization? Not just on the basis of energy or on the basis of materials. I think the thing that really struck me recently, and this is another example of transformity increasing as you get into the center, the urban center, literally the physical layout of the land, systematic diagrams that assess this at a very fundamental level. It is interesting, though, and I was talking about this morning at breakfast, that we have this huge thing that has occurred in our country, this divide between urban life, city life, and what's happening in rural life. And all the transformative benefits are seemingly accruing into the dense urban centers. And nature doesn't work that way necessarily. How could we potentially redistribute some of these transformative benefits from urban centers to rural areas? And then the other idea here, again from Odom, which is really interesting, humanity for years rode renewable energy in terms of sun and wind and light. And then we've had this amazing industrial revolution, which is all based upon fossil fuels. And he sees these as waves. He sees these as pulses. He sees pulses as being natural to all systems, whether cosmic systems or Earth systems. A volcano is a pulse, right? A sun going supernova is a pulse. And we are pulsing right now on fossil fuels. He also proposes we'll pulse in terms of information. It's possible that we are riding an information storm now and we've already peaked and we're beginning descent, right? Because now we're having a real big debate about what is truth. Okay, so those are the things I wanted to provoke you with. Now I'm out of here.
All right. So hi there. This is my second COFES. My name is Jeremy Herman, and I'm a founder and CTO at a company called Plethora, and we're a rapid manufacturing company that does subtractive CNC machining, and we try to make parts very quickly, automatically from 3D models into the whole process plan and production of the parts. But today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some other stuff. So leaders or laggards? How can we embrace new technology for the next generation of design tools? And I feel like on the bottom left here, and we've talked a bit about it in the past, I think it was one of the early speakers referenced AR, like augmented reality in construction, and how that's actually made quite the inroads. There's a few different smart helmets out there, the Daiquiri smart helmet, HoloLens, the Meta, and this is sort of next-gen utopia right here. You're controlling this robot arm. You're seeing it right in front of you, and where this thing might be eventually in your warehouse. Unfortunately, that utopia is quite a far way away, I feel, even though we have some of these rudimentary tools available to us right now. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about where we are today. And for instance, I see a lot of people here have laptops. I see you're probably running some engineering software on it. I know I've been a Mac fan since I was a little kid, and I virtualize SolidWorks, and I run it in Windows on a Mac. I have to encode some special keystrokes so I can use it without a 3-button mouse. I see a few mice around here. Laptops have been around for a while. Multi-touch technology has been around for a while. We have our head in the sky with this augmented reality future utopia, but I feel like we're tripping over our feet on the ground because we're still not embracing the technology that's already saturated the market. And for instance, this is the CEO of SolidWorks, John Paulo. He's showing off SolidWorks running on a Mac in a virtualized environment, and that's fantastic. It definitely democratizes usage of SolidWorks to people that are on different platforms, but really it's a Band-Aid on top of a tool that was designed for a different technology, a different platform. And in the same way, we see a couple different approaches for something that we probably all have in our pockets right now is in the App Store. What are our design tool makers, how are they approaching these devices that everybody has? And if you go to the company page of Autodesk, you see they have about 30 or 40 apps, mostly acquired, mostly just put on there that are kind of separate from Autodesk's core technology, but still making inroads to where the users are and trying out kind of lightweight apps to see what might stick. And but they're still not full versions of anything. It's still baby apps. And meanwhile, I see Mark, you have an iPad Pro there. They're fully capable machines. They're fantastic, as long as the software is designed for that use case, for that user interaction. And I don't think any of our design tools right now are really making the best use of that. But there's different kind of steps along the way. And you can see Dassault has some inroads on here, but there's still not a lot of representation from some of the largest companies out there that make engineering software. And I think that's a shame. But I think there's an opportunity for people to rethink their approach to that. And I brought a prop. So who here knows what this is? You're not allowed to answer. Oh, sorry. This is a keyboard, obviously, but it's a specific keyboard. Does anybody have any guesses of which vintage? It's a little bit. It was made the same year I was born, 1984. It is. Yeah, it's a. Okay. It is an original Macintosh keyboard, the 128K. So now there's something missing from this that's on all of your keyboards now. Does anybody see what's missing at all? Ouch. Function keys are missing, but there's something even more fundamental than function keys that are missing. There you go, arrow keys. Now, why would the original Mac not have arrow keys? Make you use the mouse, exactly. But not only make new users use a new tool, but also to prevent old software that only ran on the console from being ported straight to the Mac. Because nobody wants to use a Mac, use console software on a Mac. And Steve Jobs had a hand in getting those arrow keys off just to force people to use the new interaction model. And I'm worried that we're not going to get to this augmented reality utopia, that instead we're going to go to a dystopia where I put on my AR goggles and I have a computer workstation, a virtual one sitting there with a 3-button mouse. And I really don't want that to happen. So I'm trying to get everybody excited about these new interaction models. And the best part about it is that all the software that everybody here, I mean, gosh, there's so much talent and history in this room right now. You've been doing it for 30 years, more. The hard software that you've written, these CAD kernels, these fundamental building blocks, those don't go away when user interaction models change. They form the foundation of all software going into the future. And we get to build on top of that. But that doesn't mean that we can cling on to old user interaction models. And that's where I just really want us all to kind of contemplate with not just like the technology that's nascent, but the technology that's already in our pockets, in our bags, and how to make better use of that so it's easier to use for everybody. And I got one more. So, how can we empower designers as the ecosystem of manufacturing processes becomes even more diverse? And here you can see, there's been a lot of manufacturing processes for a long time. You got casting, forming, joining, machining, injection molding. But then you have all these new additive processes, and it's not getting smaller. It's there's becoming like more and more of them. So you have kind of odd ones like electron beam melting, which I'm not sure if we're going. Sorry. No worries. You have these laminate object modeling, and then fused deposition modeling, SLA, SLS. These are getting more complex, and in order for people to design parts for these different manufacturing processes, God forbid, combine them all into one product. It's going to not just require one specialist per process. We're going to have to make tools easier to use so people can build intuition on how to design best for these different manufacturing processes. And we've already seen or heard from a few other speakers about $1 trillion lost. Jack, you were talking about that for bugs that are in software. I'd guess that it's an equal amount for bad usability, and it's a big deal to make these tools easier to use. So that way we can design faster, really democratize access to these tools.
Thank you. I have to make a manual transition here.
All right, so I have 5 slides. Actually, 2 of them are builds, but wanted to start here, and I'm basically preaching to the choir. There's a
Mark,
lot of
microphone.
microphone. Testing 1, 2, 3. Is that okay? All right. So my first, what I was going to share with you was the ideas of what circular economy is, how technologies are trying to accommodate that, and then some of the challenges with the adoption of the technologies, and then leave you with some questions in the end. The circular economy, it's a concept, I think it was last year or the year before I introduced to DAS. It was a concept that came out of one of the universities in the Netherlands, and it's pretty much preaching to the choir. This is just basically a value chain for products, material and parts, manufacturers to the going all the way to retail, and the idea is to minimize energy waste and landfill. We've been talking about that all morning. And the general idea for two different types of products, formula-based products, is basically recycling and replenishment of raw materials, soils, etc. And the idea for discrete products or assembled products is how to go through the recycling to reduce as much as possible the mining and exploitation of the earth, water, etc. We've been talking about that all day today. So that was just to set the stage for the nature of the technologies and Gartner's analysis of how those technologies are being adopted. Now, Gartner has a number of tools we use to do these types of analyses. By the way, how many of you are familiar with Gartner? Okay, I didn't introduce myself. I'm the global, we're now a $3.3 billion company, and I'm the global lead in engineering design, and I do a lot with the manufacturing community as well. One of the tools that Gartner uses, so let me actually talk about some of the factors shaping strategy and software. And I was inspired to introduce this slide from that complexity textbook, taking a look at some of the forces that are interacting and basically having effects of some technologies will be successful and other technologies will not be successful. The three elements of key factors that are affecting the market are, number one, the growing business complexity. We've been talking about that today. IT advances and new product and manufacturing technologies. The business complexity is being driven by labor costs, material costs, new regulations, product customization, etc. The IT advances are being, the key ones that everyone seems to be talking about are big data and analytics. We talk a great deal about digitalization of the enterprise, IT-OT convergence, and this relates to IoT, for example. And another big one everyone's talking about is machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, all of those can play a role in sustainability. And some of the significant technologies, Jeremy, for example, was talking about 3D printing, scanning. Advanced materials has become a big thing, aligned, and of course that has sustainability impact as well. And embedded software, that's been brought up today as well. So these are major driving forces shaping at least the nature of technologies and uses of technologies to support sustainability. One of the tools that Gartner uses to assess the maturity of technologies is this thing called the hype cycle. How many of you have heard about the hype cycle before? Raise your hand. Okay, I see there's about 20% of you are not familiar with it. We assess the maturity of technology, and a lot of things in life follow this. There's initially an innovation trigger and inspiration, and as we evolve and develop those ideas, we get really excited about them. After we've been with them for a while, we find out that in practical use, they're not as great as we thought they were, but then we figure out how to use them. I always compare it to my marriage. the innovation. The innovation trigger was when I met my wife. The peak of inflated expectations happened after a few dates. The trough of disillusionment happens about 6 weeks or 6 months after you're married. Right. But then you decide that you can live with the person. And then plateau of productivity is you start having kids. So it applies to almost everything. Technologies, families, whatever. Now, the general, if we get back to technologies, the general trends that we see with technologies, if you look, for example, at the internet, and I really apologize for some of the graphics here, but technologies that could transform, if you think about the web, the trigger was back in the 1970s with ARPANET and BBN. Both Bermick and Newmark developed TCP/IP, and CERN created the World Wide Web. In the 90s, the late 90s, we were at the peak of inflated expectation, billions and billions of dollars being invested in what perceived opportunities with the web. By 2003, 2004, we discovered what will and will not work with the web. And we're basically, as we started to figure out what will and will not work, the leaders established themselves. And we're, I would say, with the web at the plateau of productivity. It's part of the fabric of our life. So we have these types of curves for many things, for insurance applications, for sustainability, for product life cycle management, engineering and design, government, you name it. And there are more than 100 of these types of curves. And I looked at the sustainability one. And what we do is we plot the presence of different technologies along these hype cycles and see where do they fit and how long is it going to take for them to mature. So here's what we had developed for sustainability. Oh, one other point on this. How many of you are familiar with Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm? Raise your hand. Okay, most of you are. The chasm is somewhere after the trough of disillusionment. It's during that slope of enlightenment where we're figuring out how to use the technologies and going beyond. So that's the critical point. Now, when in our hype cycle for sustainability, notice this. Almost, now a number of analysts created this. What we do is, for example, I created the technology profile. Use that same technology profile in my PLM hype cycle, and it's used in a few other hype cycles as well. Now, 6 or 7 analysts produced all of these. They are all left of that chasm, which means that there's a risk they may never really get into the market. And we've seen some presentations already on some of these to the left, and the question is, okay, there's proof points that they work, but will they be adopted by the mainstream? Will they become the fabric of the way we live our lives, the way we, for example, car sharing services, the way we design buildings, et cetera? We saw some great examples just before. And again, that's, you know, I think about this book that Brad shared with us on positive reinforcement or positive feedback loops, reinforcing feedback loops. And I think it's a good question to raise when we have the discussion, when I shut up already. But I want to make a point, just one more, and then getting back to some of Jeremy's discussion in terms of what does it take for these technologies to cross that chasm where you have the reinforcing feedback loops, multiple factors coming together that make these technologies a success. You mentioned SolidWorks. Let's think what made SolidWorks such a successful design tool. Okay, number one, there was a mature geometric modeling engine. Number two was Microsoft's OLE, object linking and embedding. Number three is parametric and feature-based design. Technologies had matured. By the time SolidWorks was established, D-Cubed was already there. So, you know, those are three. Can anyone think of any others? Three of the factors that made it successful. Another one was, yes?
Well, just there was the paradigm. There was already a high-end modeler out there. This does everything that one does, only cheaper. Yeah.
Right. And also the performance of PCs. Yeah. Okay? So you think about these were all existing technologies. What was the catalyst? What made them so successful? I believe the catalyst was prior to SolidWorks and actually Solid Edge, and that raises another interesting question. Prior to SolidWorks, on every engineering desktop, there was a Linux-based or a Unix-based workstation, and then you had your PCs for office applications. So it was very obvious that with a tool where you are on a high-performance PC running Windows, you can have a single workstation, get rid of that Unix workstation, and be able to do their work. There was that cost incentive, that economic incentive that made it successful. And then there was something else in the book that Brad brought out, which Brad gave us. I started thinking about Solid Edge versus SolidWorks. Now, Solid Edge is an excellent tool. And we've done evaluations of Solid Edge versus SolidWorks. And in those days, Solid Edge was actually technically superior to SolidWorks. That may not be true today. I haven't done the evaluation in a while. Why did SolidWorks overrun the market? Why did they become a much bigger CAD vendor? I think of the example of VHS and Betamax. VHS was out there first. Betamax was superior technology. It was brought out in the book. What the SolidWorks people did was a superior job of building those reseller channels. So anyhow, I think about it and just the parallels between the book and here, and I'm just saying, and I'm going to raise the question and finally stop. Why are all of these technologies and those tech profiles that are positioned, et cetera, by multiple analysts at Gartner working independently? So they're not spread out all over the place, they're over there. So the first question is, why are they all locked over there? And then the second question is, what is it going to take? What are going to be those reinforcing factors, that catalyst that's going to create that positively reinforcing feedback loop that is going to get them from there to there? So I'll stop.
So when I invited Mark to speak at DOS, or be a conversation leader at DOS, he said to me, I don't do anything on sustainability. I don't think I have anything to contribute to the conversation. And this is probably one of one of the most illuminating things we've seen today. So that's great. Let's take it to the floor.
Any comments?
Yeah, my one comment, observation, which echoes this, is the company Carrier. So today in HVAC industry, what we're doing is literally the stupidest thing we could be doing, right? We take a bunch of air, which is a very inefficient way to hold heat and or moisture, and then we modify that air, adding moisture, adding heat. We blow it down ducts, which further degrades it and degrades our human health, and then we blow it across your bodies. And it always makes you either too hot or too cold. It is so dumb. But it was an accident of history. It was a man, Carrier, and it was a particular time and a particular set of technologies, and it took off and it self-reinforced, and there you have it. What we are trying to do is to move to radiant systems, because you're a radiant system. And the goal isn't to blow a bunch of air in here. If the building is at the right temperature, that ceiling's at the right temperature, you're at the right temperature. But trying to change an industry when this stuff has gotten locked in is damn difficult.
Yes.
I totally concur.
Vincent, wait for the microphone so we'll record.
So the answer to your Carrier analogy is because it was really, really easy to retrofit. That's why it's been, yeah. I think my observation on the different technologies is you need a big enough delta to make the jump from being interesting and early adopter focused to being mainstream. The delta's got to be pretty big. So you go out to the data center, right? If you're Microsoft and you're running your Azure data center, the delta of having the most effective, environmental and other characteristics is massive, so it's a no-brainer. But for a lot of the other things in there, either the delta is just not big enough, or the barrier to adoption, the Carrier analogy, is too high. And it's really hard to speed that up, especially with existing systems.
Yeah, and so if you look at, I completely agree with you, and you look at things that are disruptive. And I followed your career. I worked at Red Herring, and I know Mark for a long time, and I've read his things. If you look at like lithium batteries, right, which were developed by the science of nanotechnology, 15 years ago, the numbers coming out from the analysts about lithium batteries were, the volume's going to be in the trillions. Well, it didn't happen because this is disruptive technology. Just like you were doing the analogy of the air conditioning, we continued to use the batteries we had because we were using the batteries we had, and we couldn't manufacture the lithium batteries in the United States. All the lithium batteries were manufactured in Japan, in Korea, in China, and there was never enough adoption of that technology here. Right, Mark? I mean, that's a technology that just didn't manifest in the United States because it was disruptive, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't. I thought you were making a comment to the audience.
I was, but I know that you follow and write about disruptive technologies, and I'm just commenting about there's been a number of disruptive technologies that just have not been implemented, even though the analysts 15 years ago said that the market for these products would be $1 trillion, and the market was not, they just couldn't gain traction in the markets.
Well, different analysts analyze differently. They extrapolate. There's good analysis. There's bad analysis. I don't know how they come up with those numbers. I would suggest that when they came up with the numbers, it was at that peak of inflated expectations. And we always hear ridiculous things in the analyst community. When I'm asked about the size of markets or the potential of the markets, I become very uncomfortable and I say to our clients, how many of these predictions have been correct? And they just start to laugh. So, yeah.
Real quick about that, I feel like this chart, it's super helpful to identify, where we are in these hype cycles, maybe for, let's say, like a 10-year time span. But, I've heard a lot about how technology is, its impact is overestimated in the short term, but underestimated in the long term. And I feel like we're only seeing a certain part of this. Like, for instance, ride sharing. We certainly haven't seen the peak of the impact of ride sharing on us, especially with autonomous cars coming out. This chart goes on another 50, 100 years this way, and it's way taller than any of the peaks that it's already happened. And I feel like that might be the same case for batteries, like lithium ion. I mean, with what Tesla's doing, with even shaping demand, like what we saw in the previous presentations. So I wouldn't give up on it yet.
So I have a canonical set that kind of, I think, scratches. I don't know if it's canonical. You tell me. But I think that there's this issue with complexity isolating high risk investment portfolios. So that you have a portfolio and a high and when it's very, very complex, it's 6, 7, 25 layers of abstraction from the decision maker who makes the investment. That's one thing that we're seeing. There's a great book out called Quantum Investing. There's another thing, which is that if you look at the preponderance of the energy consumption, it's in the construction industry, and so that's in terms of energy. I don't know if I can say that completely with these experts in the room, but there's a lot of energy used in buildings and a lot of inefficiency. And then something that I just have been observing from my field, which is in small satellites. Last year, I was talking to an angel investor in building construction technology, and last year at COFES, we kind of got talking into it, and we have about a 7-point similarity between a new construction of a large building, state-of-the-art building, and a spacecraft. You have a long time consequence that when you do something, it lasts for a long time. You have a totally a brand new site that you're going to every time. You have a totally different workforce non-consistency between the builders. You have materials that the certification and the supply chain of the materials going into it are extremely unstable. And there was a list that goes down, and it's like buildings are very, very similar to spacecraft in a lot of ways. And what we have seen in the, if any of you have a spare weekend, head out to Utah, like middle of nowhere Utah, and Logan, Utah, at the University of USU, anyway, I don't remember, Utah State University. They are busting at the seams, standing room only, the epicenter mecca of the small satellite explosion. And when I say explosion, come to me afterwards for the numbers. But the consequence, that started with a standardized interface when they went to Kazakhstan and said, this payload, this satellite is not ready. Can you swap it out? And they said, I don't know. You got to go ask the paper guy. He keeps the paperwork for the certification. And he said, is the second satellite certified to the same standards as the one that you're replacing? And he said, yes. And they launched it. With 3 days out from a launch, they switched the satellite. And you've seen these movies on YouTube where the dam in the beach gets set up and the tide brings and the storm pulls up the sand and the river, the stream flows in behind it and builds water on the dam. And it's that thread of water that, you only have to, like, the kids will do that. They'll go and they'll dig out this reservoir of a river and then surf for an hour or two as this reservoir flows through and tears this beach to pieces. And that's what's happening with the small satellites in the space industry, is that there's these complexity spirals, and these are very, very, very well understood complexity spirals, where you drive, in this particular domain, you drive a capability spiral between small, highly integrated parts, extremely low cost to capability performance, and high risk, and that spiral drives and has really broken that sandbank and allowed all these small companies to surf and really start up that second the hype is over, and like the investment portfolios, there's a mad scramble of all the angel investors. There's a satellite constellation going up called OneWeb. They're going to have between 1,000 and 2,000 satellites delivering broadband, and this is reality. I mean, they're already building it. They've got the facility up. They're going. It's going to happen. A launch vehicle costs $11 million. A launch vehicle and a satellite for a polar LEO orbit costs $11 million. Like. Anyway, so in terms of like complexity, there's a lot of similarities, and this looks like that. So.
Well, yeah, but that's exactly the point, in that it could be either combinations of the technologies, some type of event, and then almost at the drop of a dime, all of a sudden a number of those are going to perhaps combine and then rush right through. That's why I told the story of SolidWorks. There were a number of other CAD vendors trying to do the same thing. Why were they successful and the other ones weren't? It's this combination. And also the other effect was Dassault Systems buying SolidWorks, because although people saw the benefit of it with a big company behind it that was letting them run themselves, they had more confidence in the viability. But it's these factors that have to come together at an appropriate time where things had been building for a while in terms of PC performance, whatever. But it's the same thing here, and that's, so what's it going to take? We're chock full of stories here about all of the waste going on, what's happening in India, what's happening in China. We're going in the same direction here in North America. What is that trigger going to be?
He passed. Jack's next. Then after that, it's got to be somebody that hasn't spoken yet. Let's do Jack.
I suggest there's a very straightforward and clear way to look at this chart. It represents why engineers are never asked for a second honeymoon. On the left side, the focus is on the problem to be solved. Those that make it over to the right side focus on the value that will be appreciated. End of sermon.
Peter.
So I've got a question to the room, and that's that if we look at past waves, we could identify clipper ships, steam engines, iron, bronze. There was a major technology that drove this. And my question to the room is, what is that major technology? Because what I'm seeing is a bunch of, basalt rebars, and I'm seeing a bunch of little things that could add up to something. And if it's just little things that add up to something, it's a revolution in how we organize, not in the technology that's kind of required. So I'm just, anybody have what is there a technology driving this? I don't know what it is, and I wish somebody would tell me.
I would submit it could be more of a business issue driving it. You raise
that's my point.
Wind-powered vessels and steamboats. Steamboats, it was smoky, it was dirty, everyone was scared of it. What was it that drove steamboats? It was reliability. The business motivator was that you didn't need wind for steamboats. It was the fact that based on coal, those can travel on a particular schedule, independent of a natural factor such as the wind. And that was the real business motivator for it. And that's what I'm saying we're going to need here. There has to be, we're not suffering enough here. And that's why India and China have been.
Yeah. Mark, I was just looking at your key down here, years to mainstream adoption. Is that a forecast, or is that?
No, it's a forecast.
Okay, so
or wild ass guess.
All right, but it didn't. It's not an indication of how long it took them to get to where they are now.
No,
it's
no,
a forecast.
It's a forecast.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I never explained that. A forecast of how long it will take from them to get from the current positions on the chart to the end where it's gone mainstream.
So if you're a yellow triangle and you're over here, you're in deep doo-doo, right? Sort of.
Possible.
Yeah. I really got a lot of insight out of this, and Jeremy, what you layered on top of it, and it made me think if we took your earlier chart at the beginning of this part, which was meant to talk about something else, right? The 3 waves. So if this gets extended into waves, and it would be interesting to know, what happens to these technologies on the 2nd wave and on the 3rd wave, and so on.
Right. And as they move over, then there are new norms, which then stimulate brand new thinking. My parents grew up in the golden age of radio. We grew up in the golden age of TV, and my kids are growing up in the golden age of internet. And so new norms are established, and they think in different ways. So,
Jack just said something to me that sort of rung true. And if you go back to that slide I showed originally, sort of, just sort of, DSRP, maybe, and I was really surprised that was proposed as a technology equivalent to DNA, as a complex adaptive system. This idea that there are distinctions between things, that there are relationships between things, that these things fit into systems, there are wholes and there are parts, and then there are multiple various perspectives on them. And maybe what we're really talking about here, maybe the real technology is the technology of our mind and our understanding. And because we didn't even have systems thinking until we started having ecologists, and they started asking themselves questions about very complicated dynamic systems. And as they began to understand that, we began to develop this notion of systems thinking and complexity. And so maybe that's the future technology, is how do we parse this stuff and get better at understanding these combinations and these impacts, and better at discussing our often conflicting perspectives that we flip back and forth between our own minds all the time. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut up, and somebody has to say something that hasn't spoken yet.
So someone was asking for a higher level or more ambitious technology or whatever just a few minutes ago. So the one thing not talked about is artificial intelligence, and maybe we could hope that our artificial intelligence will more and better see the relationships between things and be better at systemic thinking than we are. And maybe one day artificial intelligence will decide that we have to be sustainable in our ways of doing things.
So I wanted to mention something just about, sure, there's new interesting technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, but I feel like one of the most exciting things that might be kind of a coalesce of all this technology is accessibility. And you were talking about the kind of those waves going away from the city center into rural areas. That's all about democratization of access to technology, making tools easier and cheaper, and especially when that collides with the power of technology. I mean, in a way like the SolidWorks analogy, where it was a cheaper tool that did a fantastic job on hardware that more and more people had access to every day, and that's a huge thing. And that's where sure, the PC revolution kind of has come. It's going to stay here for a while, but there's new technology that everybody has access to, and we got to democratize that. And I'm super excited. I think there may not be one specific technology that it all coalesces under, but just more about access to it.
Actually, you raised another interesting question, which should be part of COFES over the next 2 days. Will the cloud have the same effect that that Wintel has had?
I looked at Mark's chart a little differently as kind of an example of E-Room's law. E-Room is more spelled backwards. And so you get into these things, and there are a lot of factors that are outside the technical model. And so until you work through all that, you're not getting anywhere. That's a learning process. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. So a couple of little examples. Workarounds. The farmers with Deere advanced equipment hire hackers to get them to circumvent Deere. The history of gas pumps. 25 years ago, you could watch TV, you could order a hamburger, you could use an ATV on the most advanced gas pumps. Do you see any of that today? No. I just want to pump gas. I don't want all that stuff. And so you just have to work through all the ancillary factors other than just the necessary subcomponents of the technology itself.
And I do think a lot of those ancillary factors are business cases. And I feel like if we view innovation as a sustainable resource by itself, the kind of things that will hurt that are basically feeling rigidity, I'd say, in a business model, and sort of this feeling of like not familiarity, but not expanding your business out to reach new people. It's like when you're with somebody you should break up with, and you just can't bring yourself to it. But when things are feeling good, and I feel like that's the way a lot of these engineering tools are right now. And it's super fun to see tools like Onshape that are accessible in the cloud, really easy to use, no install. I know there's a really neat tool, a neat CAD modeling tool on the iPad that uses the pencil input in a very innovative way. And I love seeing those kind of experiments, but it requires thinking outside of the box and trying new things.
And a business model. And with that, let's do the transition into our final topic, which brings it all back together, which is economics. This is a perspective, and economics and the study of economics began before we even understood the first law of thermodynamics, much less the second law of thermodynamics. And one of the students of Howard Odum was a man named Charles Hall, no relation of mine, although that is my father's name. And these diagrams come from Charles Hall. He wrote a great textbook, college-level textbook. I actually read it a couple of years ago. And this is the notion of energy return on energy invested. And this is fundamental. The comment was made earlier that when we first were poking holes in the ground, we couldn't keep the oil from gushing up. We got 100 units of energy for 1 unit of energy to get it. In the 1980s, or 70s, domestic oil, we were running at an energy return on energy investment of 20 to 1. All right? Nuclear, photovoltaics runs down here at a little bit less than 1 to 1. Domestic oil in 2000, we're at 15 to 1. Nuclear is at 8 to 1. Natural gas is at 20 to 1. Tar sands, we're not even sure if we actually get a unit of energy back for the unit of energy it takes to get fossil fuels out of tar sands. These are the physical realities of our planet. That is what's driving everything that's going on right now. Energy is what enables technology. Energy is what enables economies. All of these gadgets out here are because of energy, and we are starting down an energy descent curve. ExxonMobil has already said we've got less proven reserves this year than we had last year. So this is what Charles Hall speculates is our future. The amount of energy that it took to keep our economy going is just getting greater and greater and greater because it takes more energy to get that energy. Those are the fundamental physical facts. Now, maybe we will get to some nuclear energy that's clean. Maybe all this fossil fuel really is created by microorganisms that are deep in the core of the earth. I hope so, because I've come to the point where I realize we have to become a technological civilization, and we have to start thinking in terms of 10,000-year projects if we're going to survive. And if we don't create an economic system whose main economy creates some feedback loops that restore our environmental resources so that we continue to have environmental resources to do work, we will not have an economy. That's where we're headed. This is the notion of alternative currencies. This economy that we have is a total artificial construct created to finance the Church of England's war. And it's been gone ever since then. We have entered into an unholy alliance with a group of people that we gave monopoly power to print currencies. And governments do that. They create a currency by forcing you to pay taxes in that currency. And in the Great Depression, we would have crawled out of depression a lot faster if in this country we would have allowed alternative currencies to emerge. And guess what? These alternative currencies oftentimes carry demurrage fees. They actually lose value because that forces it back into the economy. There's an awful lot about these systems that we haven't even begun to really come to grips with, but here are 5 reasons why our economy drives non-sustainable behavior. The impact of boom and bust cycles was what Peter was talking about last time, which is built into this. Short-term thinking is promoted because of the concept of discounted cash flow. Because of interest, that money is worth less in the future. Therefore, any benefits in the future are worth less. It just forces short-termism. And it is, of course, all based upon growth because, again, thanks to interest, you better have growth or the damn thing collapses because it's a pyramid scheme. And interest, they did a big study in Germany on this. Interest just systemically creates inequality, period. Interest, over time, in any system, moves more and more of that money into fewer and fewer hands. What's the rentier class? And then this notion from the 70s on, the argument that was between Friedman and Drucker. And the notion that what we did was we really unleashed greed and envy as a mechanism of selling more stuff. Those used to be virtues in this country.
So in a way, economics is about motivations. Why do people do what they do? And I think we all probably had the economics class. We were all supposed to be rational thinkers. And then guys like Kahneman, Tversky, Kahneman got the Nobel Prize saying, no, we're emotional thinkers. You know, that drives what decisions we make. So the first question I've got is kind of sustainability of what? Because what's the motivation? In general, in this room, we've been talking about sustainable of resources, energy and things like that. And sustainability is usually framed as mitigating a loss, which is exciting if it's your loss, maybe not so exciting if it's somebody else's loss. So if I'm in North Korea, the sustainability means I'll do whatever it takes to stay in power. You might say that our Congress has 2 varieties of that going on too. Sustainability as a species is an issue that we occasionally, the reason to put things in space is so asteroids don't hit us. We are actually, you could make a case that we grew up thinking that the world was continually get better, we get smarter, and that we would never have another Dark Ages. Well, that's not a foregone conclusion. You could make the case for the Dark Ages. And what I'd like to introduce is this notion of the sustainability of the human spirit. What are we building cities for? What are we building for? Is there a way of kind of get to that? So the first question is kind of sustainability of what? If you look at sustainability in terms of economics, obviously, it determines a whole lot of that. And I would not separate economics from culture. The two are inseparably divided. There are some cultures where you're not allowed, it's evil to have interest, and other where the more the merrier. So that, in a way, the two go together, and it determines a whole bunch. So we leave that. If you look at the world today in terms of a very broad picture of how are we doing sustaining the human spirit, then you could say, well, we got some problems. We have unspeakable conditions for some. Here in this room, by and large, we're doing pretty well. We are the privileged 0.1% of the earth. We're not fleeing from oppression. We had food on our table more than we could want just now. We do have 2 broad and conflicting cultures that believe in infinite resources, even though we know it's mathematically impossible. We have the sort of fundamentalists, whether I'm a Jew or a Muslim or Christian, be fertile and multiply. There could be no climate change. We will provide, which says really just keep growing until the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse trim you down and then hope for the best. And we also have a business culture. We also have a business culture that says quarterly growth forever will exist. We'll never run out of resources. So we have these 2 very powerful cultures in the world whose basic premise is one of infinite growth, because for the first time in the world, at a time when there were 100 million or 10 million people in the world, we were not constrained by resources. This meeting the constraints, finding the edges of our planet is something that's relatively new in human history. We have loss of jobs and purpose. And this is not just China taking them or all the Mexicans taking them. China has automated more jobs out of existence than all the jobs that we've lost. That's a huge issue in the future. We have there's always booms and busts, but we've been living the illusion of continued growth, yet every 10 years having booms and busts and things like that. So the kind of, what is the shape? You want some booms, but you don't want to have a huge bust, and we now have the technology to have busts that we've never seen. I mean, there's a book about the last chimp standing. You know, that's us. And there's no guarantee that we're not going to put ourselves out of existence. We have rising, anybody read Piketty's stuff? I mean, it is a fact throughout the world that we are kind of back to the old, you know, kind of kings and princes age of rising inequality throughout the world. We worry about the national debt, but we have huge other debts that we're not acknowledging. Every time we create a Superfund site, every time we fail to repair infrastructure, those are debts that the future generation is going to have to pay. We're gladly, putting nuclear power plants with the thing of, oh, we'll always have the money to take care of those wastes. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. We have safety nets going awry in two directions. We have them not there when some people need them, and there to such an extent that people worry about motivation and work and how do you go from there. We have failures to fund value-adding. So much of our wealth has come from things like our public education system, our investments in R&D. Those things are getting harder to fund. And as a result of this, we're facing increasing conflict at home and abroad. So we have a whole bunch of sustainability of human spirit kind of problems. And we really do need kind of a new way of thinking. So just as sort of stimulating conversation, it strikes me that there are a couple things we might try. One is that we have converged over saying that money is the sole measure of someone's worth. Measure is the sole measure of someone's contribution. And lots of people are saying, no, there's kind of dual, if you think about the cultures of being on stage or an artist, there's another scale. And we've always had that, and that's a very healthy thing. I'd also suggest that by and large, we've measured things by bigger is better. The bigger the yacht, the faster the car, the more impressive the IMP building, the better. And it's a unidirectional measure. And then we come in and say, oh, and by the way, we can save some costs. And the only people interested in saving costs are like the building owner. Otherwise, it's tragedy of the commons. Nobody's, I'm not interested in saving your costs, if they're in a commons. And so if we could think of every single measure of being kind of a value added over value extracted, so it's a numerator, so that when I build a building what's this purpose of the building? A little bit to your original point. What is the value that this building or this park or this city is going to provide? And then how do I provide that value with the least extracted? And if I were to extend that, imagine comparing two lives. One, a Goldman Sachs banker or a hedge fund guy who is worth $100 million and has throughout their life done one good thing. I mean, if you think of the highest thing that finance can do, they're like talent scouts. They go, you've got a great company. I'd like to invest in that. This is an underperforming asset. Let's go invest in that. So they're like really good talent scouts. That's a real positive value. And at the worst, they create financial gains to exploit a loophole in human derivatives and just have our 2008 thing. So if you go value added over the course of life, well, you helped a bunch of companies. Value extracted, you were the 100 guys most responsible for taking $3 trillion out of the economy in 2008. So that might be kind of a negative. And then we pick another guy who spent his entire life picking up aluminum cans off the street to make $10,000 a year. And he pulls $20,000 worth of that guy's had a positive value. I'm just suggesting that if we always think of a metric as a good gained, the resources required to go into it, that might be an interesting way of doing figures of merit for green buildings, figures of merit for lives and things like that. And another issue is, there's work to be done around the world. We have enough work for 8 billion people to do. We've got potholes to fix, kids to teach. The issue is not work to be done. We probably can have enough food, enough housing, and enough clothes for those 8 billion people. The question is, what economic system do we invent that allows us to do that? Transparency and trust, I mean, that's another issue that, a little bit of an issue here, but a system like this is going to require broader transparency and trust. And just the last kind of conversation starter is, if you think about biological systems of sustainability, there are different models of sustainability. A 17-year locust has a model. I come around, I eat everything I can, and then I disappear. That's a little bit like boom and bust in economics. The oldest organisms on Earth, 6,000-year-old trees, have another thing. They say we're going to have rich and lean years, but we're going to prevail throughout that. And I'm not sure you can argue that one kind of economy is better than the other, but I'm kind of on the side of trees.
Read that slide for you, probably have already. I think the conversation's still a little bit tame. We're trying to talk about the future in the language of the past. I came out of a school of business, Professor Emeritus School of Business. Used to look at a room full of accountants. What the hell kind of a plague are we unleashing on the world? And you talk with finance people or economists, can't you talk about anything without trying to monetize it? Even had one tell me if it didn't have a dollar sign in front of it, it didn't exist. Well, that's extreme, and he soon saw that was foolish. But it illustrates the mindset. It's very deep, and you can hear it in here. We measure things by money. Can we get away from that? So I propose something radically different. Talk to you about it here or any time during COFIs. Can we promote environmental regeneration, living by the assumptions we've had in the past? That almost answers itself. No. What assumptions do we need? What new language do we need? And I'd propose to really break the thinking. Think Spaceship Earth. This is not a new thing. First thing I ever read about it was Robert Heinlein, Orphans in the Sky, written about 1940. Spaceship lost deep in space. Many, many generations had passed. They knew kind of how to run the spaceship. They didn't really know how it all worked. And most of the sci-fi that I've read has a big flaw in it. How do they feed themselves? No attention paid whatsoever to the kind of biology you need on board to keep the thing going. Most of them imagine this great, vast source of energy. You can develop a phaser that empowers all the energy of the sun, and you'll whip every alien coming at you. That corresponds with our sort of tribal warrior culture here, so it attracts people. But it's not particularly real. So, question, what assumptions should we make? I'm not going to try to answer that. I'd like to hear you. A lot of people have thought about this to a degree. Kenneth Arrow did. Bucky Fuller did. There's a movement now called Rethinking Economics, with a book called Econocracy. These are, believe it or not, economic students all over the world questioning what the professors are telling them. They're finally waking up. This is BS. So what is and what isn't? I don't think they've progressed much beyond questioning the old framework, and that's what we need to do. There's smart people in here. I want to hear what you have to say. There are a lot of bits and pieces. You can hear it in a room. There's a book by Daniel Wall out, and I've forgotten the title of it now. It's not been out very long. He's gone through every movement in the environment that I can think of, and some I hadn't. and yet there is no cohesive framework that we can attach to. There are a lot of little different frameworks, each with a different twist, some with a different language. I wrote a book, nobody pays attention. Writing another book, useless. There are more books written than anybody can read already. So what are we going to do? And I'd love to hear from you.
You know, I think it's very important what you said. We are focusing too much. First, we're using the language of the past, and we are focusing too much on criticizing the existing system and not thinking about really understanding what the reason was that we made over the last 250 years this enormous progress that led us into a situation that doesn't seem to be sustainable for a global civilization if we continue on the same path. So I think it's really important to go back and think about that. And what was said a little bit earlier today was that when we changed the idea of the purpose of a company, we changed really how the world was developing over the last 35 years. So why don't we think about the purpose of economy as it was defined by Adam Smith saying, create human wealth. And it was, as I said earlier this morning, a great idea to get us out of poverty. But now maybe we need to redefine the purpose of economy. I'm not saying I have the solution, but I would like to put it into the audience here as a discussion. When I go back to what Criggs et al. In 2013 published as a new definition of sustainable development, where they said sustainable development is one that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding the Earth's life support system on which the welfare of current and future generation depends. We get an operational advice of what we need to do to have an economy for humanity and not one against humanity. And an economy for humanity would have two purposes. Create welfare for all of us. We don't talk about the distribution, which is capitalism or communism is all about distribution. It's not about the purpose of economy. And then the second purpose is to safeguard the Earth's life support system. An enormous amount of jobs would be there. We have, of course, if we want to really do a safeguarding, to overcome our addiction to crows and maybe do something else. You know, I sometimes say only cancer is really addicted to crows, and maybe we should stop to being the cancer in the Earth's life support system. So if you really think about the purpose of economy, I'm not saying I have the solution, as I said. I don't want to seem like somebody, but I think we need to talk about the purpose of economy and how we can get an economy that is actually for humanity and not against us.
Yeah, you bring up other good questions. What's a job and what's work?
I agree with what was just said, and I feel like in aspects of technology, you know, social media is a huge venue where people actually learn about things that they didn't otherwise know. And I think everybody has a part of them that wants to figure this out, right? We want to take care of ourselves. We want humanity to be what it should. But how do we use things like social media? Like, for example, there's a company called The Honest Company, and they do baby products, right? Jessica Alba's beautiful, and she's made billions of dollars or whatever on it. But there were a lot of mothers who realized there was a lot of waste when you have a baby, diapers and whatever, and so they decided they wanted to pay more money because they believed in the concept of this isn't as wasteful or this isn't as bad for the earth or whatever. And the way that it blew up is really through social media more than anything. So the whole marketing aspect of business too, how do you shift the purpose of marketing, and maybe it's impossible, from being just about making money to having these kinds of ideas being at the forefront and everybody kind of jumping onto that idea?
So we're dangerously close to the concept of leadership, and because and because this is a type of leadership where we see a problem, then we're going to go make it happen. And working for the government, I've become very sensitive to the fact that never did a government win the war of any conflict in history. It was always the people and the heart of the nation and the leadership in it. And that percolates up to the government. Well, before we were able to mass communicate, as we can now, much of the decisions, information came up and decisions came down. And there's a every leadership school you'll go to will talk about the transformational leadership where the leader asks a question. You know, best seated where is to ask the question from the place where you can see the whole scene, right? And so the leader will ask the question, and the answers will come up in plans, recommendations, and ideas in degrading level of specificity. And then the leader will give direction in terms of commission, redirect, or decline. And that transformational leadership model at a global scale is possible now, quite possible. And so that might, I mean, again, and it really increases the control authority and influence of a leader while decreasing their direct control. And so that just in terms of a thought paradigm, I'm just kind of hearing that's like a model that I've been working with to try and understand how to build very, very, very small satellites with extraordinary complexity and still give, you know, the president's appointees the authority they need. That's kind of where that's coming from, but.
I mean, so I think the system, to the question that's put up here, is a reflection of the needs of the people that system serves. And so, you know, when I contemplate that question, it's really about how do you change the needs of the people to be more compatible with growth, and or not growth necessarily, forgive me, with sustainability. I'm afflicted by the same curse we all are, right? And you know, if I go out of my way to avoid places like Facebook, but when I am pulled into that, you know, while there are occasional instances of magnanimous behavior there, more often I see a photo of, you know, the amazing dinner somebody had at an incredible restaurant or the car they just bought. And we live in a society that, you know, that motivates that growth agenda. People want the quarterly return because they want their stock portfolio to go up in value so they can buy a fancier car. And, you know, we are the top 1% or whatever of the, in fact, it's much worse than that, of the global population. But that global population aspires to what we do, right? So I think if you're asking the question of how do you create a system, I think one step further is how do you change the values of a society so that the system that they create is sustainable? And I think that's a really hard thing to do, you know, especially when you've got this self-fulfilling cycle of marketing organizations that drive that kind of natural human predisposition to want to have the thing that's better than your neighbor and to sort of one up the Joneses. And until people are willing to put the sort of long view in front of their short-term interests, I think I'm actually kind of pessimistic about the odds that we don't kind of burn the system out, right? Like it takes a very fundamental sea change in how people perceive their own place in the world and what they value.
Okay, let me give just a half an answer, or a partially formed thought. One is that I don't think we want to have a society without growth. We want growth that doesn't require tons and tons of oil and materials. So, for example, I can now read 100 times more books than anybody in history and have them on a Kindle and require very little energy or paper or trees cut to do that. So there are forms of growth that we can become smarter. We can run 3-minute miles. There's lots of things we can do that don't require us to build pyramids to get there. And maybe as an ethic for people, you could argue that each of us has 2 responsibilities in life. One is to find and foster a talent within us, so we have something to give to our fellow people. That all 7 billion of us ought to find our talent and put it out there, and that our other objective is to to be talent scouts as best we can around the world. So if you think of what is a good consumer, it's a talent scout. What is a good financial guy? It's a talent scout. So that in the part, and we now, because of the social media, the things you were talking about, we have the ability now to become really great talent scouts, not to ask, what are you bad at, but what are you good at? And we have the ability to maybe create talents within ourselves with less cost to get there. So I mean, there is at least the theoretical possibility of a society where people foster their talents, people appreciate them, and we create that value with less of the environment destroyed for every bit of talent that's created. So, just a thought.
The technology. Talking about the values, we ought to poke into that. Going all the way back, however far in history, our brains developed to where we want to do more or be more or have more significance than just be here, eat, sleep, poop, and procreate. But all life is dedicated to sustaining life. All levels of organisms do that. So how are we different and how do we reconcile it?
I think that the technology, the social media, gives us an ability to optimize on what Joseph Schumpeter brought to us back in the 50s of creative destruction. Our biggest barrier, I think, to getting a lot of this to happen is a generational thing that's part of human nature. And that is, how do we get through the vested interests of the prior generation or the generation prior to that? Okay, so us older guys, we need to give it up. But there's opportunity because of the technology, because we can coordinate and communicate and share, that we can accelerate the creative destruction. And that is what is needed to accomplish this at the speed we need to. But it also requires that those who are the vested interests are inclined to give it up. And maybe what we have to do through the technology is find incentive for them to do so.
Scott, are you suggesting an organizational ribosome that'll deconstruct the old useless things and make them useful again?
There's a reason all of us get old and die, and it's because there's a time that we no longer belong here, because new innovation is taking over, and that's the nature of the world and human nature. That is time immemorial. There's a time we're supposed to go because we don't belong here, because there's something new and better. So while we talked about all the negatives and all the critical requirements, we also have a tremendous opportunity if we can get the vested interests to move and let the innovation and the technology help us get there.
Jack has a comment he wants to follow up with.
Well, yeah, and see if I can generate a bit more optimism, right? Because, you see, economy is the study of the flow and exchange of goods and services, period. And so we all agree that by wandering around in that for the last several decades, it's not turning out very well. Because what we all want is quality of life. And so what we really need to be studying is how do we generate quality of life? And that turns out to be rather simple. It's the achievement of goals in our value systems and a celebration with one another of doing that. And most of us have said that already, except we're still in that trap of trying to use the economy to make that happen. All right? You can go beat on all the corporations you want to provide their employees with better insurance and more time off and all that. It's not going to get you there. You can't get to a quality of life through economy. So you got to leave the economy, set the economy there. We got to have an economy, but that's not why we're here. It's simply a facilitator. why we're here is to grow with one another our quality of life. And the optimism is that we are demonstrating that happens with 4, 5, 6, and 7-year-old kids without doing any brainwashing or anything else. They're born that way. What we're learning is how to stop ironing it out of them. And so the more we think about then how to establish a community, corporations and companies are okay, leave it over there. What we want are communities, right? And how we establish that. And we're probably not going to get there by enrolling in a college and listening to a professor and then taking it down. We're going to get there by starting out with the natural learners and helping them grow and experience that themselves. And once they get hold of that, you cannot beat it out of them. We've had kids that are so far down into anguish, they can hardly walk. Young lady, 8 years old, her hair down below her eyes. She just didn't want anybody to see her, etc. And after we started, about 2 weeks after she discovered the garden out there, she came in and announced that she was going to be in charge of the garden. And pretty soon she started combing her hair back a little bit, took some of her several trinkets off of her earlobes and chin and neck, et cetera. 3 years later, she was invited to be the keynote speaker at the national meeting of the Forest Service of America. And she's on her way. Right? So that's where I submit the clue is. When we leave this room, we've got to focus on building quality of life in a community. And the messengers are going to be the 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. Thank you.
Just to follow up. Oh, sorry. So I agree with you. And I think I would go to one of the first points you made, which is that it's about fulfillment within your values system. And I would also submit that there is a very powerful set of entrenched interests, which are corporations, that spend a huge amount of money marketing to that exact age bracket to establish consumers of their products and services at a very early age. And so you're competing when you're trying to enculturate a child against a machine that is acutely tuned to trying to convince that child to be a consumer that values material wealth over community engagement. And I don't think it's impossible, but I think that there's a lot that's lined up against you in the process of doing that. And I think if you're going to be successful at that, you've got to figure out how to break that cycle.
Well, I simply want to relate a personal experience. That a number of years ago, in my second year in Generous Electric Company, I discovered that none of the bosses, none of the managers knew what their employees were doing. I never went to work a day after that. I went to fun. And part of the day I did what my manager wanted, and the rest of the day I ran experiments on how to be a better person and make GE better. And that went on for 20 years, and it produced tremendous results in a small part of GE, right? So this notion that we've got to fight the corporations, I think, isn't true, because they don't know you're there. All right?
I think you're spot on there. If you look at recent human history, different organization types have had priority at different times. It was the church and then the monarchy and military and national government. And there's a reasonable argument to say the most important organizations now are corporations. They have the most power and the most influence. So fighting that from outside is a really, really, and actually all of us in this room spend probably the largest part of our life working inside corporations. So I think the first slide of the day was what actions can we take ourselves. So we spend most of our life inside corporations. What actions can we take? I would say that if you look at what motivates people, the research, Daniel Pink and people like that, Pinkster, is it? It's not money. And that is definitely changing with younger employees of corporations. They want interesting work, they want to do something that's worthwhile, and they want a reasonable degree of autonomy, not really complicated things. So, most of us in this room have a good deal of influence inside corporations in different ways. So what we can do is change the way that we lead and manage teams, and in particular the way that we incentivize them. There's, changing incentives in corporations away from money can still keep the corporation extremely successful, but start to change behaviors that are not just focused on money.
I don't doubt the power of community, but it scares the hell out of me. I don't trust people. Present company excluded. When you start talking community, you risk people manipulating things. You have to think like we think, and we're taking individual choice out of it. The county I grew up in northern Michigan to this day has less than 10,000 people in the entire county, and it's the third largest in Michigan in acreage. I'd say that there's more community where I grew up than in the big cities. But what do we tell people to do? Move to the big city. Take mass transit. It's better for the environment. Social media is inherently unsocial. I had a lot more networking back in the old bulletin board days. Social media has made this groupthink thing happen. I mean, who cares? In nature, what's going to happen is going to happen. When you start, when we talk about some of the policy changes and things like that and what can we do, that kind of worries me. We had that hype curve, and when we start implementing policies, and government regulations, that helps drive innovation and things like that. But it also is picking and choosing winners and losers. And maybe that winner that was picked wasn't really the right winner. And I think maybe sometimes the best thing we can do is just let it be. Focus on ourselves, do what's right. You're going to have a certain amount of gravitational pull with just whatever you do. And if we all stop trying to get everyone else to do what we think they should do, I think the world would probably be a better place. And the right answer will just kind of come out in the end. Probably not my lifetime, but somewhere down the road. Yeah. And then my kids will talk about how the world is screwed up and they need to solve it, just like we are.
With the value systems, though, I think we're all very cynical because we're looking at kind of the 25 and under or the millennials or whatever, and it's turned out to be a really shoddy version of what we were hoping for. But I think we underestimate our kids. So here we are talking about keeping everything organic and not setting rigid boundaries. But we do that with our children. And so we've already underestimated saying, just because there's an algorithm on my Google page, because my son likes this toy, now it comes up 5 million times. We miss the idea of intentionality. Kids can be intentional. They're just not taught to be. And so a lot of that comes from parenting, because we're like, hey, if you're happy for 5 minutes, I'll pay $15 for this toy. Please just give me some space, right? I got a 3-year-old. That's like the story of my life. I just need to go wash the dishes. But it's not intentional. I didn't give you the toy because you earned it or there is a practical purpose for it and I explained it to you. I just shoved a toy in your face. So by saying already, it's just not going to work, well, we failed our children. I mean, we've failed the next generation. So while I understand the cynicism, and when I said social media, I hate social media. My husband loves it because his business thrives from it. And I'm thinking, what kind of dum-dum is just sitting there scrolling through going, yep, like that, I'm going to buy it. And they do, That's the reality of the world we live in. So why not use that and make people think more intentionally so that when their child goes on their, whatever the page is and there's a bunch of advertisements or Nickelodeons on, it's like, that toy's cool, but I don't have to have that because I've got this, or I think that way. Let's give them a shot, you know?
I just want to jump in. I don't know that I think Darren, I don't know if you were responding to what Jack had said, but I heard it differently because to me, you were saying the same thing. Because Jack is talking about, individual action and influencing the community around him. And I think you were saying the same thing.
I just find a lot of the conversations, they kind of all come together. But, people are people, and there's going to be people game the system. At the end of the day, I need to live in this economy, in this world. So I've got to live in a city where I got a job. Otherwise, I was commuting 4 hours, or I could pay $1 million and live next to public transit.
Right.
I think a good example is Christopher Alexander's little book, The Oregon Experiment. I said, I think a good example is Christopher Alexander's little book called The Oregon Experiment, where he documents how a little town in Oregon didn't bother to have a bunch of architects design their community. They decided in the evenings, talking to one another, what they were going to do next. And it turned out, according to Christopher anyway, to be a beautiful little town, right?
And you know what? Most architects don't like Christopher Alexander, although I'm an exception.
So I think we're dancing. I think we're dancing around one of the problems, and one of the elephants in the room. That's that, for 5,000 years, agriculture employed 60, 70% of people. We had the whole culture. You can read, the rise of hydraulic agriculture, and that's and the remnants of that in our rural communities today. And then as agriculture is now 5% of the employment. The whole supply chain and stuff like that. No, 2%, but I'm put packing and grow. So 5%. We can feed ourselves with 5% of the people involved in that, not 70, 90%. Manufacturing then took over that role, and that's where we got our cities. You had to be in Dearborn if you wanted to make cars and things like that. So those two great sources of we can now build all the stuff we need, and stuff our tummies with all the food we need, with maybe 10% of the population. And there's still jobs for that 10%. There's not a problem there. The question is, what's the next great thing that employs people so they can go on and have a great quality of life? And the highest growth thing that I can see is care for Alzheimer's patients. I'm being silly, but it's not an inspirational. We need to figure that out. We need to figure out what's a system that allows people to put a roof over their heads and food in their stomach and a car that gets them if they have to go to work, and do all these other great things.
Now,
community's part of that, but unless we have those jobs, a way to earn a living, we've got problems that are very, very hard to solve.
Like Mr. Miller, I've worked for the government, and I've been accused of being a very linear thinker for a long time. I haven't said this at all today, but I'm going to do it right now. The budget, the expenses of the United States are $4.1 trillion. The revenue is $3.6 trillion. We have a deficit of $500 billion. From the time of George Washington to President Reagan in 1981, our national debt was $1 trillion. President Reagan added $2 trillion to $3 trillion. President Bush 41 added $1 trillion to $4 trillion. President Clinton added $1 trillion to $5 trillion. Bush 43 added $5 trillion. Obama it did $10 trillion. Now we have national debt of $20 trillion. There are many brilliant people that work for the United States government. I spend a lot of time in D.C. I've actually was interviewed to be Undersecretary of Energy because of my understanding of the budget. The year I was born, in 1957, our budget, our revenue, was $63 billion. Our expenses were $68 billion. They walked into President Eisenhower and they told him we were out of the money by $5 billion. He snapped out. He was very upset. Okay, I know this is very linear. Very linear. I'm accused of it all the time by my good friend Steve Wade, who's friends with Mr. Miller. So, public policy, people will say the good old days. 1962 was the good old days. So the expenses of the United States were $100 billion. 25% of our budget was DOD under President Kennedy. Where am I going with all this? Now somebody in the room might say to me, oh, you're not indexing for inflation. No. On July 31st, 1965, President Johnson signed what's known as Medicare. The first Medicare recipient was President Truman. He got 001. This present year, Medicare and Medicaid cost the American taxpayer $950 billion of the $4.1 trillion. There are things we've done right in government. Medicare, Medicaid, VA, retirement government employees. We have 100 million Americans of the 320 million Americans on a government plan, okay? So our economy during the Obama administration, the GDP was the lowest of the last 13 presidents. I'm not an economist. I'm just the public policy wonk. I don't know how many of you, Mr. Miller and my friend Steve Wade, and he's an economist, I don't know how you increase the GDP. I don't know how. But all I know is that 20 years ago, when I went to a Gartner symposium, they told me that the GDP growth would be 2% a year. And they were right about that 20 years ago. So I don't know what this explanation, but one thing I do know, as a public policy person and a former IRS employee, and I've worked in many of these agencies, there's 500 billionaires, okay, in the United States. 100 of them, Gates and Buffett, have said for 20 years that billionaires should pay more in taxes. And Buffett has said for years he should be paying 30%. Did you ever think about the fact that the Dow in 1981 was under 1,000 and now it's at 20,000 and the debt was 1 and now it's 20? Where'd all the money go? Did the billionaires, and I'm not a socialist, did they pay enough in taxes so we could generate revenue? I don't know. You tell me.
Regardless of that, if you have low growth or no growth, and you go way back in history, there were a number of civilizations, including the ancient Israelis, had a jubilee year. That's the way they worked it. Every 50 years, you just wiped out the debt and started over. Otherwise, you had a dominant owning class. You had everybody was an underclass, so that's how they handled it. Could we do something like that again? Probably will.